comes from the Sports Heritage Network. The network is a grouping of sports museums such as Lord's, Wimbledon and St Andrews Golf Museum. They designated July as Sport and Fashion Month, taking their lead from Royal Ascot for obvious reasons. Edwina has entitled her talk, "A Grass Green is a Proper Colour, Fashions from Archery 1781 to 1908. Edwina has been able to draw on the paintings, prints, drawings and photographs and the few surviving garments held by British public collections. She will discuss the clothes worn by men and women for the popular sport of archery from the founding of the Toxophilite Society in 1781 to the London Summer Olympics of 1908. For me, this is another of those exciting occasions when we can use the detail in sporting pictures as part of the evidence from the past to illuminate how things are done and how changes have occurred over time. Edwina is a dress and textile historian. She has worked for two of Britain's leading fashion collections, the Museum of London and most recently the V&A in Kensington. Her expertise lies in the history of fashion, particularly British fashion from the 19th and 20th centuries. And since 2016, her research has expanded to include the development of new textile fibers and sustainable practice in the fashion industry. Before we start, again, I'd like to thank Jamie Rowntree of Rowntree Tryon Gallery for sponsoring the series. As I said before, it means that we can continue to put these talks on for free. It also means that non-members and more importantly, future members can join us. Again, we are recording this talk for future reference. I would also like to to remind you that you can access previous talks through the BSAP website. As usual, and I'd like to thank her, Edwina is happy to answer any questions at the end of the talk. All you have to do is type the question under the Q&A tab in the bottom of the right of your screen. You type the questions and I will put them to Edwina. So that's enough from me. Over to you, Edwina.
Thank you very much, Tim. Hello, everyone. So I hope you can hear me. Now, before I begin, I must tell you I'm going to be reading this talk because if I don't read it, and I shall ad-lib too much and you will be here all afternoon. So as Tim said, I'm going to cover a period of roughly 125 years from the founding of the Toxophilite Society in London in 1781 to the London Summer Olympics in 1908. And I've really enjoyed putting the slides together for this, this talk. And it's amazing to have both works on paper, well-known portraits, and to compare those with surviving costume, because one can easily shed light on the other and solve a question that the costume historian might have. And I'll explain that as we go along. Now, just to begin, I've included one fashion plate, I think, and an advertisement in the exhibition, in the talk, because they can also shed light on the subject. Now, this wonderful detail of a plate from La Belle Assemblée in September 1931 is often included in articles about archery because I think the woman is so appealing. And her companion, who I'm afraid you can't see, is dressed in blue silk. So I think this is very much the fashion writer's view of archery. It includes some of the vital elements, but I don't think that in 1831 this is actually what ladies in the principal archery societies in the country are wearing, as I hope to show you. Now, my quote comes from Thomas Waring Jr.'s popular book, A Treatise on Archery, or The Art of Shooting with the Longbow, which was first published in 1814 and went into many, many editions. Green is traditionally associated with archery and originated in the green clothes worn in the past by hunters and foresters for camouflage. Other sources about archery and descriptions of dress worn for archery talk about Sherwood green and Lincoln green, whose name refers to Lincoln's specialism of manufacturing green cloth by dyeing wool fibres first with weld, a yellow dye, and then with woad to create green. And woad grew extensively in the area around Lincoln right up into the 20th century. Both Sherwood and Lincoln green tie this colour to the legendary outlaw Robin Hood, who lived with his merry men nearby in Sherwood Forest, and whose skill with the longbow was integral to the myth. But the printing on the left was reproduced in Waring's book. Thomas Waring Sr., who was a bowmaker and a supplier of archery equipment in London, stood as the original model. He is wearing the uniform of the Toxophilite Society, soon to be the Royal Toxophilite Society, when the Prince of Wales agreed to become its patron. So he and his employer, Sir Ashton Lever, a Lancashire aristocrat, industrialist, collector and sportsman, founded this society in 1781, and is generally credited with being the society that really kick-started the revival of interest in archery as a recreation, and a recreation involving great skill at the end of the 18th century. And toxophilites are, as I'm sure you all know, lovers of the bow. At this time, Waring was acting as Lever's secretary. Both men came from Lancashire, and they already had an active interest in archery. And when Thomas Sr. died in 1805, his 17-year-old son, Thomas Jr., took over the business, and he was the one who wrote the treatise on archery. For a green wool coat with the Society's signature gilt brass buttons was the most important element in the Toxophilite uniform, which is seen here worn with cream breeches, light-coloured stockings, black leather buckle shoes, and a tricorn hat, trimmed with single green and black plumes. The 1832 edition of Waring's book lists 47 archery societies in Britain, with 7 in London, and each was governed by regulations which included a dress code, and fines could be imposed for breaking the rules. Many dress codes were quite detailed and covered headwear and footwear as well as the permitted colours. Some clubs required clothing for ceremonial events as well as for the field, which, together with the necessary archery equipment and the cost of the admittance fee, annual subscription, and dinner fees, effectively restricted the membership to the top 5% of the population. So that's the aristocracy, the gentry, and members of the professions like lawyers, for instance. For the cost of clothing at this time lay in the fabric rather than in the making, and good fabric could be very expensive. And it's also important to know that the tailored garments, which were worn by both male and female members of the society, were made by men, and they cost more than dressmaker-made clothes. And both the Royal Toxophilite Society and the Royal British Bowmen, I'm going to talk about in a minute, specified the supplier that members should use, presumably to uphold a common standard. So the cut of the green wool coat, which is very well tailored, which you can see on the right, suggests that it was made for ceremonial wear. So I apologise for only showing you a detail, but I really wanted you to be able to see the buttons on it. Its buttons carry the device of an archery club in Lancashire, again, called Walton Le Dale. And Lancashire is in the northwest of England, and buttons carrying the emblems of societies and other sporting groups, such as hunts, were common. Now, I have just learned how to do this, and I'm hoping, yes, I hope that now you can see the buttons in much greater detail and see that they have an arrow on them and the name of the club, Walton Le Dale. So now moving on to the Royal British Bowmen. We've got a wonderful portrait on the left of Sir Foster Cunliffe by by John Hopner. So Foster Cunliffe was the prime mover behind the founding of the Society of British Bowmen in 1787. and Hopner's portrait depicts him wearing its uniform against a backdrop of Acton Park, his recently acquired estate in North Wales, where the society often met. And the Prince of Wales also agreed to be its patron in 1789, and that enabled them to rename themselves the Royal Society of British Bowmen. Possibly what's most interesting about the society is that it had the distinction of being the first archery society to accept women members, who unusually for the time were allowed to take part in all the society's activities, from shooting and dining to electing new members. So there were eligibility conditions for members, and they usually had to be proposed by another member. And then the existing members could, if we call it in Britain, blackball them if they thought they weren't quite right for the society. And interestingly, the women were allowed to take place in this process, either to vote for these proposed new members or to blackball them. So this progressive approach led to a high number of female members. And in 1789, there were 46 women and 55 male members, but many of them were spouses. The society's dress code was short and clear. All members must appear in green and buff dress under penalty of 1 guinea, that's 21 shillings in old money. Cunliffe's uniform conforms to the rules of the society while following the lines of fashionable dress. So he has a green coat, a tailcoat, which is commonly worn for sport. He's got a buff waistcoat, buff breeches, light-coloured stockings, and half boots. And the black thing by his boot is his tricorn hat, which is decorated with plumes. However, the woman of tailor jacket on the right, which belonged to Mrs. Louisa Morgan, who is a member of the society with her husband, although predominantly green, substituted pink for buff. The long undersleeves on the jacket, which were inset into the armhole rather than the shoulder to provide greater freedom of movement, that now looked tan, were once pale pink. And pink remained a feature of the lady's uniform when the style of the lady's garment changed in the early 19th century, so it was clearly acceptable. Fortuitously, a single metal button impressed with the society's emblem survives on the jacket. And the button's design includes the Prince of Wales feathers and the words associated with them, which are Ishdeen, I serve. So you can see the Prince of Wales feathers coming out of the coronet. And it says Royal British Bowman. And I think this device up here is an unfortunate bird who has just been struck by an arrow. Now, I realise it's really annoying for many people not to be able to see the front of the lady's tailor jacket. It's quite a clever design because this is very much the fashionable shape at the back of the jacket, but it is a wrap over at the front, which made it much easier to move in. And it would be worn with what is called in fashion history terms, a habit shirt. And it was called a habit shirt because it was worn by women, mainly for riding, but obviously also appropriate here. These are two engravings by the British caricaturist Thomas Rowlandson. So he published a pair of prints in 1790. And I think what they show are the blend of formality and relaxed sociability that characterized archery meets in the field, or bow meets as they were called. So one of them, which I've reduced to a detail on the left, shows 3 young men preparing to shoot. And in the second print, which is on the right, it's the young women's turn, although I have to say they don't look quite as professional as the men. And I think that's part of Rowlandson's humorous approach to his subject. An unfinished, uncoloured print, also dated 1790, with the same composition as the latter, survives in the Royal Collection with the title Archery Shooting at Hatfield House. The Hertfordshire archers, which of the print suggest, was was open to men and women, and they met at Hatfield House, just outside London, under the patronage of Lady Salisbury. It was a particularly exclusive society with equally exclusive rewards. The lucky winner of the Principal Ladies' Prize received a gold heart embellished with a bow and arrow shaft set with diamonds. This prize neatly combined the essential accessories of the sport with an allusion to Cupid and a hint of archery's potential for romance. Many years later, a character in George Eliot's 1876 novel, Daniel Deronda commented, "Who can deny that bows and arrows are among the prettiest weapons in the world for feminine forms to play with?" And there are many, many similar comments like this. There's a very well-known one in one of Thackeray's novels. The hand-colored prints show the uniforms of both sexes as blue, with the men's breeches rendered in a yellowish buff color called nankeen, and similarly colored tricorn hats, which could be white beaver hats, which were rather pricey. The women's hats are crowned with feathers and trimmed with gold ribbon to match the color of their sashes. But did the Hertfordshire archers wear blue? When the society first met in 1789, we know from a newspaper article that the women wore green greatcoats with black beaver hats with broad gold bands. Now, the colouring of the garments in Rowlandson's print might be due to ignorance. They may not have given the right instructions to the people who are doing the hand colouring, who are often groups of women, or it may be due to artistic license. But it's worth remembering that, contrary to what many books will tell you, green was not totally universally worn. So, for instance, the Marquess of Blandford Society of Bowmen wore purple. So still with the Royal British Bowmen, and these are more examples of this great Morgan family collection, which is in Manchester Art Gallery. They date to the period after the relaunch of the society in 1818. So the previous example of a woman's jacket dated from 1790. These date to the period post-1818, following the society's suspension during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which ran with a brief year of peace from 1789 to 1815, so 25 years. The society's return to Acton Park led to Lady Cunliffe being named Lady Paramount. So there was usually a principal woman in charge of the kind of female contingent. So Lady Cunliffe was called Lady Paramount, and this gave her the privilege, supported by a committee, of deciding on the dress code. So the changed fashions are particularly noticeable in the female uniform, whose high waist, long puffed and gathered sleeves, and zigzag Van Dyck trimming demonstrate an awareness of the latest Parisian styles. However, if the style was in vogue, the fabric was not. As a ditty sung at the first Bow meeting in 1819, noted at some length. Now, to understand this tiny excerpt, which I'm going to give you from a very long poem, worsted fabrics, and the dress is made from worsted. So worsted is made with what we call long staple wool, and it could be used to create a very tightly woven fabric, which was quite showerproof and durable. Now, this fabric, this worsted fabric, was generically known as stuff. And this particular type of fabric was known as wild boar. And the dress dates to 1818 to 1825. And this is the excerpt. "Ah, stuff, there's the rub, and I vow I can't bear it. Whilst there's cambric and silk, ma'am, I wonder who'd wear it. And 'tis stuff of all stuff too, is called the wild boar. Boar, it's a very great boar." So we have no idea what Lady Cunliffe thought about this, but I hope she joined in the general hilarity. The man's uniform coat is very little changed from an earlier surviving coat from the 1790s from the same family. So it's trimmed, it has a velvet collar, and it's trimmed around the front facings with velvet and over the shoulders, and it's got black velvet cuffs. And it also they've kept in the new issue uniform, they've kept the same very pretty detailing on the back of the coat, which has pairs of hearts on each coat tail. And I haven't found any remarks like this anywhere. But I think this suggests a sort of perhaps the family nature and the loving nature of this group, because there are so many couples in it, and we'll see in the next print that many children, according to the printmaker, also came along to the meet. But it does again allude to this much voiced comment that archery societies were very good places to meet and meet mixed company and potentially find romance. Now, this is the print I found very recently, in fact, this morning. And it is fantastic because it shows a meeting of the Royal British Bowmen in the Ground of Earthy in Denbighshire in North Wales in 1822. So it shows the new uniforms. And it's by William James Bennett after John Townsend. And it's in the collection of the British Museum. So what we have here is the big house in the background, and then coming down onto a kind of flat meadow over a river. We've got a gathering of people, families really. So we've got a young family in front, gathered together on a bench to watch the young men shooting at the target on the right. But what's so interesting is that although we know the jacket didn't change because of the Morgan jacket, and it's difficult to see in this print, but if you look closely, if we can get it, here they are. He's wearing his jacket. Nowhere can you see the back of the jacket apart from here, and there's no suggestion of that detail. But what's so interesting is they're no longer wearing breeches; they're wearing trousers. And trousers were coming into fashion and were very much adopted by young men at the moment. Some older men wore breeches, but it's such a good force. So put together with the uniforms, the surviving clothes that we have, it really completes the outfit. And we can also see that the young men wore, or the men generally, wore these high hats with plumes. And it's so nice seeing the young woman in the dress, of which we have a surviving example at Manchester City Art Gallery. Now, what's very intriguing is if you go into the British Museum site for search of the collections, you will be able to see that the man's waistcoat is pink. So pink was obviously a colour which in this society was shared by both sexes. And it's a very nice thing to be able to see because it unites the two uniforms. But it also shows how men at this period, for sporting occasions, and this is true actually of the rest of the 19th century, they took a more relaxed view of what colours were appropriate. But I love the way you've got the families and you've got the carriages in the background. And indeed, Rowlandson's print showed similar things, but with similar Starfish families, but there's many more people here. So it is quite fun. Now, moving forward into the 19th century, this is actually the outfit that inspired my interest in archery. It's at the Museum of London, where I used to work. It's remarkably complete, and it dates to around 1855, and it was worn by Fanny Giveen, whose husband was a captain in the 10th Prince of Wales' own regiment of light dragoons, which earlier in the century had become a hussar regiment. And when the couple married in 1851, Fanny's husband was stationed in India, where they lived until their return to Britain 3 years later. And it's possible that she wore the outfit in India as archery was practiced at some of the clubs in the hill station to which the British retreated in the height of summer. So her jacket is made from a sturdy cotton known as marcella. It's a kind of got an interesting weave, and it is trimmed in military style with horizontal bands of braid finished with conical buttons reflecting her husband's membership of the Hussars and the distinctive trimming of the Hussar coat. So dragoons were in the past kind of defensive cavalry regiment. They were merged with the Hussars, who started playing both an offensive and a defensive role. But that's what happened. Now I'm going to get my detail up again. Yeah. So I think you can just see here if I move it a bit. Yes. So on the left, we have the Prince of Wales, Queen Victoria's eldest son, and this dates to around 1860. So it's a little carte de visite. And he has been photographed wearing the uniform of this regiment, of which he was the colonel. And you can see very clearly the braiding on the horizontal, the parallel lines of horizontal braiding on the front of his jacket, and then the buttons at the end of the on the end of the length of braid, and a loop at the bottom. So you can see exactly where Fanny has got the idea from. And this habit of women acknowledging their husband's regiment in their dress dates right back into the 18th century and carried through into the 19th century. It's a very interesting aspect of women's clothing. So she's wearing a green leather belt, green leather archery belt, and so it supports her quiver of arrows, a green wool tassel for cleaning the arrow tips, a bell-shaped ivory grease box whose contents were used to soften the 3 fingers of the archery glove. So archery gloves were just had finger stalls for the 3 fingers that were used when you were kind of loosing the arrow. So yes, you've got her green wool tassel, her grease box, and the grease was apparently, it sounds horrible, composed of 50% suet and 50% beeswax. And she's also carrying on her belt a memorandum book with a notebook and a pocket for spare cards, and an ivory container for the card in use. And the belt and its accessories, as well as the leather brace, which you can see on her left inside wrist, and her archery glove, which she's not wearing in this picture, which we've taken of a museum display, were all supplied by Feltham and Company, who ran an archery and croquet warehouse in the City of London. So Feltham's specialism in archery and croquet summarizes how by now archery, like croquet, was beginning to be seen as an opportunity for young women from a wider background than previously to meet suitable young men in a controlled and discreetly chaperoned environment. So I think this is where Prith's painting fits in, this idea of archery as a lovely summer entertainment that you might take part in if you went over to friends or stay with friends for the weekend, or in this case, in Prith's painting, you were invited to stay at a grand country house. So his painting, which is sometimes called The Fair Toxophilites, emphasizes this shift. The Queen, a popular weekly society magazine, damned the painting with faint praise, describing it as a carefully executed, tame study of some young ladies amusing themselves with archery. Prith's daughters, Alice, Fanny, and Louisa, acted as models for the painting, in which Alice is seen in profile, taking aim at the target. Her pose illustrates an observation many years before by a writer in the Young Ladies book, A Manual of Elegant Recreations. And this quote comes from the 3rd edition of 1832. Bending the bow is particularly graceful. all the actions and positions tend at once to produce a proper degree of strength in the limbs and to impart a general elegance to the deportment. So upright, graceful deportment had long been seen as a sign of good breeding, and it was considered one of the great advantages of practicing archery and playing the sport. And all the girls were wearing fashionable dress, and while Fanny at least has an archery belt, neither she nor her elder sister are wearing a glove or a brace. And their younger sister, seen at the back of the group with a parasol, is posing as a spectator. Now, Alice's body is tight. Her bodice, or we call it a body, is tight and clearly worn over a corset, designed to shape the wearer's torso to the fashionable silhouette, rather than support a body in motion. Donald Walker, who published a book on games and sports in 1837, stated that women's sports clothes should be made of strong materials, not so expensive as to make it of consequence if they should be spoilt in exercise. They should not be so tight as to constrain the motions, nor so large as to embarrass by looseness. For activities which involved moving the arms, he recommended exercise stays. So these are two examples of stays, or what we know as corsets, from the V&A. The woven linen corset on the left weighs just 0.14 kilograms, and it was worn by its original owner for riding. It was manufactured between 1879 and 1885 by Charles Bear, a company with branches throughout Britain. The woven corsets are very interesting. They were made from fabric woven with pockets for the bones. They were lightweight, flexible, and very importantly, they were washable, and they provided support without unduly compressing the body. Stitched corsets, which were made from seamed pattern pieces, were more rigid and designed to provide more support for the body and to mold it into the fashionable shape. And it was actually quite difficult to clean the seamed corsets because of their construction. Both these corsets would have been worn over an undergarment, but even so, the ability to wash a woven corset was definitely an advantage. So Bayer offered both types of corsets, and interestingly, few woven corsets survive in British collections. There are many more in the Netherlands, but they were widely advertised from their introduction in 1832. Towards the end of the 19th century, as concerns increased about the potential harm to the body and internal organs caused by tightly laced corsetry, new styles were introduced for teenage girls and young women, for exercise and other energetic activities such as housework, and for hot weather. The ventilated corset on the right is an example of these new products. The spaces between the vertical whalebones and the horizontal tapes were intended to allow air to circulate, enabling perspiration to evaporate and to cool the body. However, like the woven corset, the fashionable curvaceous silhouette was not forgotten. But what about men at this period? As in the past, archery coats for men reflected the fashions of the day while respecting the traditions and requirements of the sport. So this coat has the fashionable Edwardian high collar. Sorry, it's not a high collar, it's a high collar opening. This coat from the end of the century is made from very high quality woolen fabric known as face cloth. It's still green, but a darker shade than previously, and the leather arm guard is now stitched securely to the sleeve. The emblem on the brass buttons shows that the coat's owner was also a member of the Royal Toxophilite Society, which led the revival of interest in archery a century before. And this is the button on it, and the Latin motto, colloquially translated, means "go for the bullseye," so seek the centre. So I think it's a fantastic motto for an archery club, and it's I think the arrow is very well rendered. So we really are at the end of the 19th century now, and we have an advertisement from Burberry. So during the 1880s, women's clothes were becoming much more practical and versatile, reflecting women's gradually, and it was gradual, increasing independence. This can be seen most clearly in the increasing popularity of blouses worn with skirts, particularly for seaside or country wear. More masculine styles with collars, cuffs, and ties, or shirts or shirt-waisters, were adopted for cycling and sportswear, including archery. This Burberry advertisement from 1906 promotes a blouse designed specifically for sport. Its patented pivot sleeves, whose construction did not constrict the wearer's arm movements, made it particularly appropriate for sports like archery, golf, and tennis. So for a quick closer look at it. Oops, sorry, not very well done that time. Here we are. So you can see that she's got a slightly raised collar. There's a kind of jabot tie and patch pockets on the front of the blouse, which emphasize its fullness and femininity, and then cuffs. And I decided that she must be holding a golf club. So she has the end of the handle in one hand and then the club part in her other hand. I don't know much about golf. And of course, the sporting hat, has now been kind of, it's now become generic that this is the type of hat you might wear for sport. Okay, so now we arrive at the Summer Olympics. So 2 years later, the advertisement dated in 1906, 2 years later, in 1908, Sybil Queenie Newell wore a similar, but I think a more practical outfit when, aged 53, she wore a gold medal at the London Summer Olympic Games, which was marred by atrocious weather. To combat the elements and the wet ground, she wore a tweed cap with a soft, high crown of a type often worn for golf. Now, this will be secured to her head. It looks very precarious, but it will be secured to her head with two very long hat pins. And women most women had long hair at this time. And so her hair has been piled up on the top of her head. And these golf caps accommodated a bun worn on the top of the head. So she's also wearing an ankle-length skirt, which was fitted over the body, but flared from the knee to allow freedom of movement. A blouse, which has a tie held down by tabs. I thought that was an interesting detail. And she's also wearing stout laced boots to cope with the wet, muddy ground. And she was no doubt acutely aware of the importance of maintaining her focus and concentration in the challenging conditions without being in any way distracted by her clothing. William Dodd, on the left, also won a gold medal at the Games. And in the photograph, he's wearing quite a loose lounge suit, a shirt with a soft collar and a tie, and lace-up shoes, together with a flat tweed cap. Tweed is extremely rainproof, so very practical, and I don't doubt that his lounge suit would also have been made of tweed. Both of the competitors came from old English landed families, for whom sport was a way of life, and who took great pride in their proficiency and skill. Dodd was a descendant of Sir Anthony Dodd, who commanded the English archers at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. So this battle against the French was a great British victory. But it was also famous for the skill of the English longbowmen and, appropriately in the context of the Summer Olympics of 1908, the muddy battlefield. Now, this is my last slide. When I came across this illustration in Vogue, in an article from 1915 about fancy dress inspired by sport, I dismissed it as being far too frivolous. But when I looked at it again, I thought the costume and its description neatly summarised some of the themes I've touched on in this talk. Captioned "A Target for All Eyes," the outfit is described as suitable for a demure young girl. Quote, "The white tarlatan skirt is striped around and around with black taffeta to resemble a target. And bodice and panniers are of green taffeta. The hat is striped target-like, and a bow and arrows in a quiver complete the costume. So here we have a hint of allure and romance. Her costume is, as the caption says, the green of the wood, and she's certainly ready for the ball held at the end of each competitive season. So thank you.
Edwina, thank you very much for opening up that whole subject of fashion and sport. And as usual, create more questions about how things are developed. I think I saw a hat like that at Ascot last week.
You probably did, yes. They're still very popular at Ascot.
When you were talking about Lady Cunliffe, you slipped in a quick reference to Paris and then didn't dwell on it.
Oh, right, yeah.
Was Paris a leader of fashion in sport, or is England or Great Britain demanding that we all dress up in our various uniforms, like I will do at Henley next week in my rowing blazer?
Well, the relationship between French and British fashion is slightly complicated. So the French admired the practical way in which British women dressed. British women were renowned, particularly, for wearing riding habits a lot. So instead of wearing a dress to go and visit neighbours, they would put on their riding habit, and they would go walk across the countryside or get in, drive their carriage over to see their neighbours. And the French described it as an Anglophile style, and it was admired by people like Marie Antoinette because it was essentially very practical. And these women looked good in their outfits because they were tailored to the figure and etc. But in terms of dress beyond that, British women were very firmly told that France was the fount of fashion for women's dress in general, not particularly for sport. And it's interesting, the dress that Lady Cunliffe designed was very much in tune with the fashions which were issuing from Paris. So there was a big crisis in England, and I'm not exaggerating about this, during the French wars, the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, that apart from the brief peace in 1845, we really didn't know much about what was going on. And when the British reappeared in Paris during the brief peace, eager to get over the Channel again to enjoy being in Paris, they were mocked by the French for their old-fashioned clothes. So I think people were quite aware after the war that they wanted to be well-dressed, and so the definition of being well-dressed was following the French style. That having been said, the French admired British tailoring, and Britain was generally thought to be just ahead in male styles, but British tailors were really admired. And so if you're simplifying it, you would say that Britain led for men, France led for women, but they converged when dealing with tailored sporting dress. Does that answer your question, or make it more complicated?
In part, one of the things I noticed in the dress for the archers is there's very little that is significant, make archery easier. I see eventually the arm guard was built into the uniform, but they seem to be more designed to separate them from others rather than to be practical for archery. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I think Well, certainly in terms of women's dress, I think that the Royal British Bowman dresses, which after all are the only ones that survived that I know of for women, but from the earlier period, they were, they sleeves in fashionable dress could be very constraining, and they were definitely designed so that the sleeves that mattered, the undersleeves, were cut from the armhole, not from the shoulder, like the little over sleeves. And having a crossover front would be okay. Men's coats, I mean, men, we see these beautiful print, but in reality, I think people made their own choices. So they would have worn their dresses looser or tighter, depending on their choice. And I don't think we can say, it's like people saying, well, everybody wore terribly tight corsets in the 19th century. Well, they certainly didn't. We know that, but it's almost become a myth. So I think that concessions were made to sport, but those concessions were very similar to the concessions made for riding, I think. So there are lots, I thought when I was looking into archery in great detail, there are lots of similarities between riding dress and archery dress. But in terms of the kind of archery equipment and the women's what we call the chatelaine, the belt, and the wrist brace, maybe it was just love of tradition, that it had always been like that, so we didn't need to change it. And of course, what I should have done is try to find out whether this brace was invented by a particular tailor. That would be interesting to know, whether it was one particular tailor that came up with this idea, or indeed the client. It could well have been the client who said, look, that brace is an awful nuisance. Can't we think of some other way of dealing with this? Because men had very close relationships with their tailors, So it was, and they took advice from their tailors, but they were also very clear about what they wanted, a lot of them. So there's so much that we actually don't know, really.
One of the, I suppose one struck by links to the military in these uniforms. Is there a military influence, or is it other influences on the military that they adopt?
I think that the buttons, the buttons are obviously very, they're very key to military dress as well. So the buttons were, originally produced in London and then a big trade in Birmingham. So the buttons definitely are a crossover between military dress and sporting dress. And yeah, so, but I don't think, I don't know so much about military dress, and what you tend to see are the ceremonial uniforms. And it would be interesting to get a talk, not from me, about the crossovers between military dress and sporting dress, because there must be some, particularly for things like the cavalry regiments, and hunting dress, and that would feed over into archery. So that's not really a question I can answer. But in terms of the women's dress, showing these military style details, that goes back at least until the 18th century. So when women's husbands, there were lots of volunteer volunteer militia in Britain, and there would obviously be the local squire who might lead the militia. And when he reviewed his militia, many of the wives would come along, and they will be wearing the same combination of colours as their husbands in the terms of the uniform. So they would get a riding habit made in the colours of his uniform jacket. And that goes right through into Queen Victoria's reign, that she had riding habits made which echoed the military dress.
I've read an article recently, I think it was in Hounds magazine, in this latest edition, where the man was leaving his hunting suit to his son, his evening hunting dress to another son, the beagling suit went to somebody else, and the evening beagling suit. was there an evening dress for these hunt societies as well, or
There
was
was,
we were
yeah.
seeing their dress?
No, there was definitely. So the detail of the coat from the Walton Liddale Archery Society, that is thought to be that coat is thought to be ceremonial dress. Now, the problem about that, if I'm being completely honest, is I haven't seen the whole coat, and there isn't a drawing of it in the book where I found it. But it was obviously appropriate for evening dress. So yes, there was definitely a uniform for the field and a uniform for things like balls, more ceremonial occasions. But again, you know, none of the articles I've read about society rules have mentioned that. It was only in one, I came across it in a book, just a snippet in a book written by a V&A author. So again, more needs to be investigated there.
I think my last question, Edwina, you mentioned right at the beginning that dress codes were built into the rules of these societies. Is it a very English thing to dress up to play sport and to have different uniforms? Or
I don't know. I will investigate, but I suspect it's probably pretty common across Europe, across Western Europe. Men loved uniforms, women like uniforms. Yeah, I think but I suspect, I don't know, this is entirely subjective, that it wasn't just the British. And as I said, I know that the French aristocracy who were at the court of Versailles, they were obliged to wear all kinds of different uniforms for different sporting activities. So the French certainly did at an elite level. Now, whether the very small all-male archery societies, of which there are quite a few in England, whether they would wear any kind of evening dress, ceremonial dress for dinners, I do not know. So I think, I mean, what one should do is to go back and to read all these 19th century books about the archery in general and see if you can get any more detail about it. So there are some useful articles on what's it called, Bow International site. And then there was recently a book written, which I can give you the reference for, which was about sport in general, actually.
right.
And that had a good article in it about archery.
I'm a collector of books on horse racing, but I do have a small section on fashion and sport, which included horse racing fashion. So I ought to look out for the other references. Edwina, it's been a delight this afternoon. We're coming up towards the hour, so I think we ought to let you go. Thank you for such an illuminating talk and for opening up the subject. I think the whole issue the whole topic of sporting art and the detail that is included, which you showed in that print of the Royal Bowman at Eric Hall, was it? Or
yes, yeah.
Shows that the detail can be followed through, and these pictures are important representations that we ought to learn more from. Thank you very much for your time and for preparing the talk and being prepared to answer the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking me.
And just for everybody, we're preparing a further series of talks for the autumn and winter. I'd like to thank Sally Bills for putting this program together. If you have any other ideas for future speakers or would like to volunteer to give a short talk or subjects you would like us to cover, please contact Sally or me, and we'll be very happy to discuss the ideas. Thank you again, Edwina, and to everybody. I look forward to seeing you in the autumn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much
Bye.
appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.